All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Art of Awesomeness podcast. I'm your host, Adrian Kiswani. It is episode 77, and you might notice that this is the second time in a row that Christian is not here on the podcast. I don't know if that's ever happened before. I know he's missed an episode before. I don't know if he's missed it twice in a row, but I'll go into that in just a second. And this episode is going to be more or less of an update podcast episode. Going to update you guys on kind of what's going on behind the scenes here in the podcast and kind of the future of it, as I kind of hinted last week. But before we get into any of that, we do, of course, have the national days, which is going to be International Medical Science Liaison Day. Liaison. I don't know how to say that word. I've never seen it before. Liaison. So if anyone's in the medical profession or field, let me know what that word means, because I have never seen it before. Apart from that, we have National Joe Day. Nice. National Scribble Day. Oh, Scribble.io. And National Spanish Paella Day, which I looked at earlier. I think it's a dish of some kind from Spain. Which, if you're into that kind of thing, try it out, you never know. But apart from that, this episode is going to be kind of in probably shorter than most. It's going to be, I know last episode was maybe about 20 minutes shorter than what we usually do. I don't really know how short this episode is going to be, because it's just more or less of an update video. There isn't like a set topic other than I'm just updating you guys on what's kind of going on. But regarding Christian's absence from the previous video and then this video, I'm going to go into that a little bit. So Christian was down here in California, I want to say about a week and a half ago. And he flew in from Vegas. I think he spent some time down in Santa Barbara, and then he came back up here where we grew up and where we live. And we hung out. We got the chance to actually talk in person, which was nice because, with him being in Nevada and me being still over here in California, it makes it kind of difficult. But while he was here, we had a pretty good conversation about some of the experiences that we had the past year or so, and really just kind of talked about our friendship. We talked about kind of, I guess you could see the ideal of being best friends, right? Having that kind of desire to upkeep a friendship, right? Which I think we've talked about before on this podcast before. Maybe not in much detail, but I know that we definitely hit on it before. But it reminded me of one time where he came here. I think he was coming from Las Vegas. I think he was coming back to visit. And he was here. He was at the house. We were filming the podcast maybe earlier that week or later that week. I don't exactly remember, but there was one day where him and I were meeting for something other than the podcast. We were just hanging out, and it was completely unpodcast related, just hanging out. I think we went to the park or something like that. And I kind of brought it up to him when we were hanging out. I was like, oh, this is interesting, that we're hanging out and it's not podcast related. And he was like, yeah, that doesn't happen often. And what we both kind of realized, especially I guess on his side of things, was that really, for those who don't know, and I don't know why anyone would know, but for those who don't, pretty much Christian and I only really hang out and converse whenever we're recording the podcast, right? So if you really want to know how often Christian and I interact and talk to one another as best friends, you really only have to go back and watch the videos of this past year, because that's pretty much all the times that we actually interacted with each other. The vast majority of the times that we interacted with each other was just recording this podcast. And of course it makes sense. He lives in a different state, new school, new surroundings. He's getting acclimated, and obviously I'm busy here. So logistically, we kind of knew once he moved that it would be more difficult to remain in steady contact, right? Because when we were in high school, for example, you're seeing each other every day. It's kind of hard not to talk to people who you see every day, right? And Christian and I were best friends. And, growing up, and when Christian ended up moving out of state to Nevada, it wasn't one of those things where, I know a lot of people when their their best friends move or something like that, and they're just like, I'm still gonna be your best friend, man, friends forever and stuff like that, because they're all worried that they're it's gonna be the last time they see each other and all that stuff. For Christian and I, it wasn't really like that. We've been friends since we were children. I mean, I'm talking, what is it, fifth or sixth grade, something like that. We've been friends for a long time. And so it was never really a worrisome thing in our friendship where we were like, oh, are we going to remain friends once you move or when we go to college and when we, go our separate ways, quote unquote. And so, for a lot of people I knew in high school, they were best friends all throughout high school, and then they move, they go into the military, they go to a different state. They obviously, most people attend different colleges than the people that they knew in a high school. And so a lot of people in high school split up, and the friends that you're friends with in high school stay that way. They were just friends in high school, and then you move on to create new connections, new friends, and things of that nature, which is completely natural. But at least for Christian and I, it was never really a concern to the point where we were worried that it would negatively impact our friendship, right? The distance of him living in another state, going to another school, and all of the difficulties that arise with that, right? So it was never a concern. At least to me, it wasn't, and I'm sure for him it wasn't either, because we talked about that before. But one thing that we did notice is that, obviously the podcast was in many ways utilized so that we could have, obviously an excuse to hang out and talk via Zoom or something like that when he was away in Nevada. But what he brought to my attention, kind of fast forwarding back to when he visited earlier, just this past week or so, he brought it to my attention that, our friendship was basically only hinged on making the podcast, in the sense that that's really the only time that we hung out or talked extensively. It was always regarding the podcast in some way. And so what he brought to my attention, and I'm paraphrasing here because we talked for quite a while, but what he was saying was, really he wanted to spend more quality time with important people in his life, like, his family, me, and his other acquaintances and friends. He wanted to make more quality time for those people that was outside the realm of content creation or something that's a bit more structured and rigid. He just kind of wanted to, or at least what he explained to me was that he essentially wanted to continue building the friendship that was upon something other than just content creation, right? So, which completely reasonable, makes sense. And I was like, yeah, for sure, dude. We're of course you want to spend as much time with your best friend as possible and improve. Even if you have a good friendship, right, you always want to try and improve and grow that friendship that you have, right? So that was brought to my attention when we hung out. But what he also kind of brought to my attention, and this is something that it's kind of been on both our minds for a while, and so this is why this podcast is more so of an update, because I just want to make sure that everyone who listens to the podcast is in the loop and kind of knows what's going on, at least in my mind, in Christian's mind, since obviously this is a weekly thing that we both put out. And what he basically proposed to me was to end the Art of Awesomeness podcast as it is, take a break from it, and then focus on basically just working on friendships and relationships outside of the realm of just recording and editing and that kind of a thing. Which, at least for me, to be completely transparent with all of you, because I think that's important, and I was planning on making this kind of episode eventually, is that my plan for this podcast as of recently was to end it and kind of cap it off at episode 100. We've already had this podcast for over a year now, which was a milestone in and of itself. And I think the next milestone probably that we'll hit is episode 100. And so my goal, my intention was to cap this podcast off at episode 100, take a quick couple week break or something along those lines, and then revamp the podcast, new name, with a more focused kind of grounded direction that was more akin to the earlier episodes of the podcast, right? Have more guests on, things of that nature. And so that was my honest plan as of, I want to say 2 weeks ago, was to cap off this podcast at episode 100. And that was kind of the plan. That was what I was shooting for. But in regards to the friendship, I basically, I was telling Christian, regardless of whether or not I end the podcast, obviously we're going to hang out more, spend more time apart from just content creation and stuff like that, so that we can maintain a strong and healthy friendship, right? And so that much was squared away. But to answer the question as to whether or not Christian will be seen on the podcast again, because that might be a question that you have right now. As of right now, Christian is taking a break from the podcast, and he's taking a break from content creation in general in order to strengthen his familial and friend relationships, which again is completely understandable. And I respect him for making that kind of judgment call of saying, hey, I need some time to actually kind of assess my life and not, lose myself into something that is keeping me from actually attaining things that I would like to attain, right? Good relationships with people. So it's a completely understandable and respectable desire, right? So that much is clear right now. He made it clear that he would be willing to guest on the podcast, and he's not opposed to, being on episodes and things of that nature. But I think the weekly, consistent week after week grind of making these podcasts, weighed on him, and it weighs on me too. Making a podcast certainly isn't a walk in the park, when you have to, record for long periods of time, edit for longer periods of time, and do that on a regular basis when you're also balancing school and work and things of that nature. It definitely adds a certain level of weight, but it was never really a weight that brought me down or discouraged me in any way. I'm more so the kind of person who likes that level of consistency. But as far as what's going on right now, Christian has been, a co-host of this podcast regularly for over a year now, which is a feat in and of itself, right? To be able to have that level of consistency as well, right? On top of moving states and schools and things of that nature. So to anyone wondering if Christian's going to be back on the podcast, he will be back on the podcast, but he's not, at least as of right now, from what I understand, he's not going to be a regular on the podcast week after week after week after week. And so that is something that I wanted to make sure is kind of out there, just so people know, just so people aren't like, oh man, where's Christian? Did anything bad happen? Nothing bad happened. Christian's okay. Everything's good. It's for a pure purpose, man. He wants to strengthen his real relationships with people, which is entirely commendable, So just so you guys are in the loop, and just so everyone who watches this podcast knows, that's what's going on, because it is a pretty big change to, especially for those of you who have been watching. We've been making this podcast over a year now. For those of you who are still watching week after week, obviously, as you know, Christian's been a part of it from day one. So if you're used to seeing Christian every single episode, and then all of a sudden he's just out of the picture, I didn't want anyone to freak out and be like, oh, what happened? Is their friendship in a bad place right now? Is Christian all right? Is there some kind of contention going on? And the answer to that is no. Christian just wants to spend more time developing his relationships and strengthening his relationships with the people in his life. And again, this doesn't mean that Christian's like completely voided from the podcast. He's just deciding to take a break. And he very well will probably be on the podcast in some episodes every now and then. And that'll be awesome because I love recording the episodes with him. But with that being said, I've also basically thrown out two pretty big bits of information. One, that Christian's no longer going to be a regular on this podcast, at least for the foreseeable future, which is update number 1. That's a big update. And then update number 2 is that this podcast is going to end. Now, before anyone freaks out and is like, oh my gosh, is this the last episode? No, this is not going to be the last episode of the Art of Awesomeness podcast, and this will certainly not be the last episode of me making a podcast of some kind. That's not what's happening. And for anyone who is worried or concerned, if and when I end this podcast, it will be a known thing. It won't be this thing where, an episode comes out one Sunday and you're like, oh man, I'm really excited for the next week's episode. And then you go to the homepage of the channel and it just doesn't show up. And you're like, whoa, they didn't upload, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to just leave you guys hanging, so to speak. If we decide to leave the Art of Awesomeness and end the podcast as it is, you'll know. It'll be a known thing. It won't be a secret. It won't be something that kind of happens in the background. It'll be a known thing. There will be a clear date. Okay, we're ending the podcast this week, this episode. It'll be a known thing. So for anyone who gets a little freaked out at the uncertainty of, will this podcast be around next week? This podcast will be around next week, and it's for the foreseeable future. I see myself having a podcast of some kind. And so with that, I want to ask you guys, because I know that obviously most of you who reach out have the ability to comment in the comment section. You can DM me on Instagram. It's just my name, Adrian Kiswani. My current intention, to make my intentions just purely known, is to end this podcast at episode 100. I then intend to restart a new podcast, kind of revamp the podcast with a new name, kind of a new goal, a new objective, a clearer and more grounded goal, and essentially start a new podcast. It's my question to all of you, because of course, if you're still watching this video and you've been watching us for months or years, I mean, it just makes sense for you guys to be in the loop of things, right? We don't have a huge, audience, and I want to know your input as far as whether or not you think I should end the podcast earlier. Do you think I should, or like earlier than episode 100? Do you think I should go for episode 100, cap it out there, and then revamp the podcast? Or would you like to see a revamped podcast sooner? Let me know what you think. And if I'm not being clear enough for you, if I'm not maybe explaining things well enough, things always sound better in my head, but when I say them, sometimes they might not come across as the most, understandable or relatable. So if you have any questions, if I'm not explaining things maybe the way that you understand them, feel free to reach out to me. If you want to email me, comment in the comment section, DM me. Again, it's just my name, Adrian Kiswani. And just ask me like, hey, watched your podcast episode. You were talking about this and that, and I didn't really understand it. Can you clarify? And I'd be happy to respond to you and clarify, any questions that you might have, any suggestions that you have for the future of the podcast. I'd be happy to hear anyone's input, and I'd be happy to respond to anyone who provides feedback and provides questions, because it is only fair, right? But this podcast, it means a lot to me in the sense that, I've never made this podcast for views. If you look at the amount of views that our podcast episode gets, I'm not doing it for views. I'm not doing it for money. I've never gotten a dime from YouTube for making any of these videos. If anything, it hinders, some other aspects of my life, when I have to fit, schoolwork and actual work and the podcast into my life. Sometimes the podcast is draining to do. Sometimes it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. But for me, it's always been a worthwhile endeavor. I really enjoy, I really, from the bottom of my heart, enjoy making these podcasts. I enjoy making content. I enjoy the process of coming up with ideas and relating them and editing and uploading and making connections with you guys and bringing on guests and things of that nature. I mean, for me, I get a lot of personal fulfillment out of just the process of making the podcast. And I've learned a lot via this past year, episode 77 concurrent weeks of constant uploads. It's taught me a lot and it's been great. And I plan to continue, if even when this podcast ends, I do still intend to have a podcast. Even if it's not the Art of Awesomeness podcast, there'll still be a podcast that'll be being made, and I'll be making sure to put my full effort into it. But to Christian's point, we want to make the best content that we can, but if we're not in the best place and we're getting burnt out, sometimes you need to take a break, revamp some things, and so that you can come back stronger and continue on a better path. And so Christian is taking that break. He's taking that hiatus, and I don't know when or if he'll be back regularly. He'll probably just be a guest from now on for the foreseeable future, who comes on every once in a while if he feels like it and wants to. But for me, I am going to continue this podcast, The Art of Awesomeness, until I eventually end it, which right now I feel like is going to be episode 100. Again, if you have any recommendations for me to make it that or maybe end it earlier, let me know. But also know that whenever I choose to end this podcast and cap it out, I'm probably going to take a quick break as well, maybe a couple weeks or something like that. But I will then come back with a new kind of revamped, revitalized podcast, starting from the ground up. I mean, a new channel, new name, all of that good stuff, and with a more clear cut direction. I want to make the podcast the best that I can make it, and so if that means, I take The Art of Awesomeness and I say it was good for that time, gonna cap that out and then start a new podcast with everything that I've learned from this one to make that one better, then I'll do that, right? If that means that I can improve the content that I'm making and just make things better. So those are my thoughts right now. Again, nothing's concrete. Currently planning to end the podcast at episode 100. Could be earlier depending on what kind of recommendations I get from you guys. And again, I'll let you know. You guys aren't going to be in the dark about anything. I'll let you know dates and plans and times for pretty much everything in the foreseeable future. So don't worry about that. It's not going to be a situation where you show up to the homepage of the channel and then there's just no new videos. If the podcast ends, again, I'll let you know. Just like I'm letting you know right now. I wasn't planning on just continually making episodes by myself and then everyone just kind of shaking their heads like, well, where's Christian? I want to let you guys know what's going on behind the scenes. I want to let you guys know what's going to happen in the future. And again, if you have any recommendations, suggestions, if you have any questions that you want me to personally answer, believe me, if you reach out via Instagram, if you DM me, if you email me, if you leave me a comment, you're not bothering me. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to respond to people who reach out. I want to make sure that the community that we've built here on this podcast, albeit a small community, is a community that understands what's going on and everyone's kind of in the same loop. And so that much I want to make clear to all of you. And I just want to make sure that I'm being as transparent about the podcast, about its future, about behind the scenes as I can. And kind of a last note on that, I know that sometimes when people leave certain projects and things of that nature, we don't have a malicious group here on the podcast, but I've seen other YouTube channels where some guy who's been there for years will leave, and then everyone just bashes them in the comments. If you're gonna send Christian anything, just send him love, send him well wishes. Honestly, he knows what he needs in his life. For the most part, when Christian decides to take a break on something, or he assesses something and he's like, this is awesome, but I think I need to kind of regroup, then it's for the right reasons. He's the kind of guy who's very self-aware, and he knows what's kind of going on in his own mind. And again, it's not my place or anyone else's place to tell him, no, you have to be on the podcast. It's up to him, right? So if you're gonna send Christian anything, send him well wishes. And again, it's not like Christian's never gonna be on a podcast episode ever again. It's not like he's banned. He'll in all likelihood be back on a couple episodes every now and then. He'll probably be a regular guest, but as of being a regular host of the Art of Awesomeness podcast week after week after week, again, for the foreseeable future, that's probably not going to be the case. But, apart from that, everyone's doing well. Everything's doing good. These are the plans for the podcast. This is what's going on. This was a little update for you guys, just so that you're in the loop. I hope that none of this kind of shook anyone or ruined anyone's day. I know that sometimes when change happens and you weren't expecting the change, it can be a little bit, it can rack the mind a little bit, especially since the podcast has been relatively the same for about a year. Obviously changes can be a bit jarring. So, I encourage you not to worry. I encourage you not to stress over anything that's going on in the podcast. Again, we'll keep you in the loop. You'll know what's going on. And I just wanted to make that update video just so everyone knows what's up, what's going on. But with that, I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode of the Art of Awesomeness podcast. I know it's not the typical episodes that you see, and I know that this podcast is probably going to undergo some pretty radical changes in the next few months. And it is my hope, it's my dream that someday I will, after this podcast, I'm going to make a new one, and it's going to be better, more focused, and higher quality than this one ever was. I don't plan to stop podcasting or uploading content. To be honest, the Art of Awesomeness is my first real content creating endeavor, and it's been great. It's taught me a lot, but as far as I see it, it's really only the beginning, and there will be plenty of Christian and Adrian content in the future if that's what your concern is. And I would implore you guys to just not worry and not stress over anything that's going on at the podcast. And again, love you guys. Thank you so much for watching for this long. If you've been watching us since the beginning or near the beginning, it means a lot that you even click on these videos and get something out of or at least I very much so hope that you get something out of our podcast. And I love you guys. You guys are awesome, as the Art of Awesomeness implies. And that's all I got for you for this episode. But before we end, we do of course have the verse of the day. And that verse is going to be Proverbs 29:25. And that reads, "The fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe." Pretty self-explanatory, but a good verse of trust and faith. So with that, thank you guys for watching episode 77 of the podcast. Again, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, concerns, I know I sound like a teacher right now, feel free, DM me, email me, all that information on the website, contact info. Just type in Adrian Kiswani in Instagram, you'll find me. And again, if you want to reach out. I'll be happy to respond to you. I'm not going to leave you on red. And thank you guys for watching. I'll update you soon, and I'll see you next week. Until then, take care.